Canada's immigration debate has changed, not because Canadians suddenly became anti-immigration. It changed because large numbers of Canadians no longer trust the government's ability to manage the system anymore. And this week's announcement allowing 33,000 temporary workers to transition toward permanent residency only intensified that feeling. The number itself isn't even the point. What people actually heard was something bigger. Temporary. It no longer feels temporary. Underneath all of this is a much larger question about trust, political fragmentation, and whether Canada's political system is still capable of reflecting the complexity of the country itself. I'm Christopher M. Michaud, and this is The Canadianist.
From the headlines to what's really going on underneath. This is The Canadianist. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Here's Chris.
Hello, friends, fellow Canadians. I am Christopher M. Michaud, and this is The Canadianist. Welcome to the podcast. So Canada's immigration debate has entered a new phase, and many political leaders still seem uncomfortable admitting it openly. For years, the conversation around immigration was framed in very simplistic moral terms. You were either considered pro-immigration or anti-immigration, compassionate or intolerant, open-minded or fearful. And that framing no longer reflects the reality Canadians are living through. Most Canadians still understand the basic argument for immigration. Canada has demographic challenges. The country needs workers in certain sectors, businesses need labor, and economic growth requires population growth to some extent. Canada is also a country built heavily through immigration historically, and most Canadians still take pride in that. Those realities haven't disappeared. What has changed is the public's confidence in the government's ability to manage the scale, speed, and consequences of what unfolded over the last decade. This week, the federal government announced a new pathway allowing 33,000 temporary workers to transition towards permanent residency. Now, on paper, 33,000 people in a country of 40 million plus doesn't sound enormous, but the reaction across the country was immediate. And that reaction tells us something important. People are not responding emotionally to the number itself. They're responding to what the number symbolizes. To many Canadians now, the word temporary no longer feels believable. And that trust has been eroding for years. Over the last decade, Canada dramatically expanded multiple streams simultaneously. International students, temporary foreign workers, postgraduate work permits, and asylum claims. At the same time, housing construction, infrastructure, and healthcare systems didn't keep pace. Neither did wage growth. Canadians can feel that imbalance in daily life now. They feel it when trying to rent an apartment or buy a home, or get access to healthcare, or trying to navigate increasingly strained infrastructure, even trying to compete for entry-level employment. And that last issue is becoming particularly sensitive. Parents increasingly look at their own children struggling to find basic entry-level jobs, while many low-wage sectors appear to have changed dramatically in a relatively short period of time. People notice those changes. Pretending people don't see what they see only deepens distrust. At the same time, many of the people who came into these programs arrived legally through policies Canada itself created, promoted, and marketed internationally. That matters too. This is where the debate becomes more complicated than the slogans on social media. Canada now finds itself trapped between realities that are increasingly difficult to reconcile. Large numbers of Canadians no longer believe the current pace of population growth is sustainable. At the same time, millions of people already built lives around policies Canada itself encouraged. And that contradiction is now sitting directly in the middle of Canadian politics. Increasingly, underneath all of this, the deeper issue is no longer just immigration. It's trust. Trust that the government understands the pressures people are feeling, that temporary programs actually have limits, and that infrastructure planning still matters. Also, trust that political leaders are being honest about trade-offs instead of simply managing headlines. That trust, whether fairly or unfairly, has been severely damaged. And once public trust starts eroding, every other national problem becomes harder to solve. One of the biggest mistakes political leaders can make during periods like this is assuming public frustration is entirely ideological. A lot of it is experiential. People are comparing daily life now to what daily life felt like 10 years ago. They're comparing rents, traffic, doctor access, competition for jobs, the pace of growth in their communities, and the visibility of change. And whether people are right or wrong in every individual conclusion they reach is almost secondary politically. Perception matters. If large portions of the population begin feeling that major changes occurred without public consensus or adequate planning, and without honest discussion about trade-offs, trust begins deteriorating quickly. That is what Canada is dealing with right now. And to be fair to the federal government, some of the original concerns they were trying to solve were legitimate. Canada did face labor shortages, and the country does have an aging population. Economic growth had slowed, and businesses were demanding workers. Those were not imaginary problems. The issue was never simply that immigration increased. The issue was whether the scale and speed of expansion exceeded the country's ability to absorb it economically, socially, administratively, and psychologically. The last part is very important. Countries are not spreadsheets. You can't simply increase population numbers rapidly and assume that social cohesion automatically adjusts in perfect synchronization. Everything absorbs change at different speeds: communities, infrastructure, culture, especially people. And when governments move faster than the public's ability to psychologically process what is happening around them, frustration starts building underneath the surface. That frustration is becoming politically visible now. You hear it in conversations everywhere: coffee shops, Ubers, at the hockey rink, on social media, family dinners. The emotional tone of the country has shifted. What makes the situation particularly volatile is that many Canadians no longer feel fully represented by the existing political options available to them. Some Canadians feel the Conservatives are closer to where the public mood currently sits on immigration, affordability, and social strain. Others are deeply uncomfortable with the tone or broader direction of Conservative politics. Meanwhile, many voters see the Liberals as more institutionally stable or internationally credible, particularly during a period of geopolitical and uncertainty. But those same voters may simultaneously feel that the Liberals lost public trust on immigration management, housing, and population planning. That leaves a growing number of Canadians politically stranded somewhere in the middle. And that political exhaustion is becoming part of the story too. People are tired. Tired of ideological shouting, being told that they're either xenophobic or naive. Tired of feeling like every national conversation immediately turns into moral warfare. Again, most Canadians are not extremists. Most are just trying to reconcile competing truths at the same time. Yes, Canada likely still needs immigration. The country also appears to have expanded beyond what its infrastructure and systems could comfortably sustain. Yes, many who arrived here did so legally and in good faith. Yes, many Canadians also feel that the pace of growth changed the country faster than they were prepared for. All of those things can be true simultaneously. That complexity is what much of the political system still seems unable or unwilling to acknowledge openly. Instead, too much of the public conversation still gets dragged back into simplistic binaries, either total celebration or total rejection. Neither reflects reality. The deeper issue now is whether Canadians still believe their institutions are capable of managing difficult trade-offs honestly. Because once that credibility weakens, almost every national issue becomes harder to stabilize. Once trust in institutions starts weakening, everything else becomes harder to manage. Housing tensions worsen. Economic anxiety deepens, and people become more suspicious of each other and less confident that the system is functioning fairly. And that may ultimately be the real danger Canada is facing right now, not disagreement. Democracies are built to survive disagreement. The danger is losing confidence that the system itself is still functioning coherently. That is the emotional mood increasingly emerging across the country. Hello again, welcome back. I'm Christopher M. Michaud. This is The Canadianist. We've been discussing the Canadian government's decision to fast-track 33,000 temporary foreign workers on their path to permanent residency. Now, what's really going on underneath this immigration debate is that the country's problems have become too complicated for where our politics currently sit. That's the real issue. A lot of Canadians don't fully see themselves in either major party anymore. You can feel that now in conversations everywhere. People sound conflicted. Someone will agree with the Conservatives on immigration or affordability, and then 5 minutes later they say they don't trust Pierre Poilievre on trade or international issues. Someone else will defend the Liberals on economic stability or diplomacy, and then immediately start criticizing them on housing, population growth, or the cost of living. That's becoming very common now. Canadians don't fit neatly into political camps. And I think that's one of the reasons the mood in the country feels so unstable. The problems Canadians are dealing with right now overlap each other constantly. Housing affects immigration discussions. Immigration affects labor markets. Labor markets affect wages. Wages affect affordability. Affordability affects mental health, family formation, quality of life, and public trust. Nothing sits in isolation anymore. That's why so many political arguments now feel incomplete. People hear one side talking and think, yeah, that's true, but that's not the whole picture. And that frustration keeps building because everyone feels like part of the conversation is missing. Take immigration again. A lot of Canadians clearly want the pace slowed down. I don't think there's much debate about that anymore. But many of those same people also understand Canada still needs workers in certain industries and that the economy can't simply stop overnight. And at the same time, there are Canadians who strongly support immigration in principle, but still admit the country appears to have expanded faster than housing, infrastructure, and healthcare could realistically handle. That's where the old political labels stop working properly. Canada was never really divided into clean ideological camps in the first place. Most Canadians have always carried mixed opinions about things. The problem is that our political system increasingly pushes people into opposing sides that don't truly reflect how they actually think. And when people stop feeling represented properly inside the political conversation, frustration and anxiety start building very quickly. Now, politics feel like the old cable television packages. You know the ones I'm talking about. You look through them and you think, okay, well, there's a few channels here that I actually like, but there's also a whole pile of crap that I never asked for. I don't even watch. But you're forced to take the entire package anyway because there's no option that actually fits you properly. That's increasingly how a lot of Canadians seem to feel about politics now. You agree with part of what a party says, disagree strongly with another part, and then spend the entire election trying to decide which problems worry you the most. That's not really enthusiasm. It's political risk management. And I think that's why public trust has weakened so much over the last years. It's not only about disagreement. Democracies can survive disagreement quite easily. The bigger problem, starts when people stop feeling represented accurately. That's completely different. You can disagree with a government and still believe the system broadly reflects the country. What's happening now is that a growing number of Canadians don't feel that anymore. They feel like the political conversation itself has become too simplistic for the reality people are living through. Everything turns into absolutes almost immediately. If someone criticizes immigration policy, they get treated by some people as if they're attacking immigrants themselves. If someone else defends immigration in any form, others act like they're ignoring affordability pressure or housing strain completely. There's very little room left for people trying to hold multiple thoughts at the same time. And most people are actually holding multiple thoughts at the same time. That's the irony. Most Canadians are not extremists. Most are trying to make sense of competing pressures all at once, while politics and social media keep demanding total ideological loyalty. Social media especially has made this much worse. The algorithms reward emotional certainty. And anger spreads much faster than nuance does. The more absolute someone sounds, the more attention they usually get. Real life doesn't work that way. Most people's views are actually kind of messy to begin with. Someone can support lower immigration growth while still believing immigrants themselves are not the enemy. Someone can also support climate action while still believing Canada needs resource development. You can want stronger public services while also believing governments need to control spending much better. Those combinations are completely normal now. The problem is that the political system still behaves as though Canadians are neatly divided into opposing camps with coherent ideologies. And I don't think that's the way the country really looks. I think there's a large number of Canadians, a very large number of Canadians sitting in the middle politically right now, feeling increasingly disconnected from how politics is being presented to them. And once enough people start feeling politically disconnected, frustration begins spreading underneath the entire democratic system. That's where this conversation starts moving beyond immigration itself. Immigration is the visible pressure point right now, but underneath it is a broader issue about representation and legitimacy. Do Canadians still feel like the system reflects the complexity of the country honestly? I think fewer people than politicians realize are actually answering yes to that question. And that's why I think conversations about electoral reform are going to become more important than ever over the next several years. Not because electoral reform magically fixes everything, it doesn't. But Canada is becoming more fragmented politically, economically, regionally, and culturally. And at the same time, our electoral system still tends to produce governments that govern as though they received an overwhelming national consensus. That gap is becoming harder to ignore. A party can win a majority government while most of the country still feels divided, conflicted, and unconvinced. That creates tension, especially during periods where trust is already weakening. And I think more Canadians are beginning to feel uncomfortable with the idea of one side winning full control of the country based on a relatively narrow slice of the vote, while everyone else feels shut out for 4 years. People want more balance now, not endless paralysis, not chaos, not 10 fringe parties holding the country hostage, but more balance, more representation, more negotiation, more pressure for governments to build broader consensus before making major national decisions. That's where this immigration conversation connects directly into the larger democratic conversation. The issue is no longer simply whether one party is right and the other party is wrong. The issue is whether Canada's political structure still matches the complexity of the country Canadians are actually living in today. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is the third part of the show. I'm Christopher M. Michaud, and this is The Canadianist, the podcast. We just finished talking about the immigration debate itself, but I want to take a step back from the policy side of it for a moment and look at the larger issues sitting underneath all of this, because what's happening here goes far beyond immigration alone. What we're seeing now is a country struggling with representation, trust, and a growing feeling among many Canadians that the political system no longer reflects the complexity of how people actually think and live. And that tension is starting to affect almost every major conversation happening in the country right now. This is where the conversation starts moving beyond immigration itself. What we're really talking about now is representation. Do Canadians still feel politically represented by the system the way they once did? I believe fewer people do. And I don't think that's only because people have become more divided. Canada was always a complicated country politically. Most Canadians have never fit neatly into ideological camps. We've always been a mix of opinions, regions, priorities, and identities. The problem now is that politics keep trying to force people into two opposing sides that don't fully reflect how they actually think, and that creates pressure. We see it everywhere. People vote for one party because they agree with them on affordability, but then feel uncomfortable with them on healthcare or trade. Someone else supports another party on economic stability. then gets frustrated with them on immigration or housing. So every election starts feeling like a compromise before people even cast a ballot. And that wears everyone down after a while. And I think that's part of why the emotional temperature in the country keeps rising. Politics start turning into a winner take all fight because people feel that if the other side wins, the country gets pulled too far in one direction. That is not a healthy long term, especially in a country like Canada. We're not the United States. Canada historically has governed more through balance, overlap, and compromise. The country itself was built through negotiation between regions, languages, cultures, and different economic realities. I think that even shaped the personality of the country over time. People joke about Canadians being polite all the time. But if you think about it, a lot of that comes from living in a culture built around negotiation and making space for one another. Oh, sorry, excuse me, go ahead. That instinct to accommodate the person in front of you is deeply baked into Canadian culture because compromise has always been part of how the country functions. That's part of the Canadian identity, whether people realize it or not. But our electoral system still tends to create majority governments that govern as though they received overwhelming national agreement, even when the country itself feels deeply split and uncertain. That gap matters more now than it ever used to. In more stable periods, people could absorb it more easily. Today, there's already pressure everywhere: housing pressure, financial pressure, political pressure, social pressure. So when one side wins power and starts pushing hard in one direction, large parts of the country immediately feel shut out. That's where a lot of the anger comes from. People no longer feel like they lost an election. They feel like they lost control of the country for 4 years. And I think more Canadians are becoming uncomfortable with that cycle. Not because they want chaos or paralysis. Most people don't want 10 tiny parties fighting endlessly over everything. They just want more balance than this: more voices, more negotiation, and more pressure for cooperation. That's where electoral reform starts becoming a serious conversation instead of just a political science debate. Not because it magically fixes everything, because it doesn't. But it may produce governments that reflect the country more accurately than the current system does. And maybe that matters more now than it did 20 or 30 years ago. A more representative parliament may actually lower the emotional temperature of the country a little bit because people would feel less locked out of the conversation entirely. That is important. A lot of Canadians right now aren't looking for total victory over the other side. They're looking for reassurance that no single side can dominate everything unchecked. That's a different democratic mood than the country used to have. And honestly, I think the political system needs to adapt to the reality instead of pretending it's still 1985. Canada has changed. The public mood has changed. The economy has changed. And the pressure people are feeling has also changed. If we don't change our politics and they don't evolve along with the country itself, the frustration and distrust we're seeing now will probably keep getting worse. That's why I think this conversation matters beyond immigration alone. Immigration just exposed the pressure that was already building underneath the surface. The deeper issue is whether Canadians still feel heard, represented, and reflected inside their own democracy. And increasingly, I think that the answer to that question is becoming uncertain. Welcome back. I'm Christopher M. Michaud, and this is The Canadianist. Well, we're into the final segment of the show today, and I want to thank you for spending this time with me because these are not small conversations anymore. Immigration, affordability, representation, trust in institutions, all of these issues are connected now in ways I don't think we can really separate anymore. But as we wrap things up, I want to take a step back from the politics just for a moment and talk about something a little deeper, because underneath all of this, I think there's a larger question Canada is trying to answer about what actually holds the country together in the first place. You know, I think one of the problems with modern politics is that we spend so much time arguing about policies that we sometimes forget to ask a more basic question first. What actually holds a country together? Not economically or politically, but culturally. What makes millions of people with different backgrounds, regions, beliefs, and priorities still feel like they all belong to the same national project. That matters, especially in a country like Canada. Canada has never been a simple country. It's never been one culture, one language, one economic reality, or one political instinct. It was built through negotiation between regions, languages, cultures, and different economic interests that somehow found a way to coexist inside the same framework. That's important to remember right now because the country is under strain. Financial, political, social. People are frustrated, exhausted, and increasingly suspicious of each other's motives. But underneath all of that, Canada still functions best when people believe there's room for them inside the country and inside the conversation. That's why I don't think the real issue underneath so many of our tensions is diversity itself. Canada has always been diverse in one form or another. The issue is whether people still feel connected to a shared identity strong enough to hold that diversity together. And that's where I think Canadianism comes in. Not as an ideology or aggressive nationalism, and not as an attempt to erase people's differences either. Almost the opposite, actually. Canadianism to me is the idea that despite all of our differences, there still has to be a shared responsibility to the country itself, shared civic expectations, shared trust, shared participation, a feeling that we're building and maintaining something together instead of simply occupying the same geography beside one another. Once that shared connection weakens too much, everything else starts getting harder to hold together. Politics become more hostile, public trust weakens, regional tensions grow, and people stop listening to each other as easily as they once did. And I think a lot of Canadians can feel pieces of that happening right now. That's why I don't think the answer to this moment is simply pushing harder in one ideological direction or another. I think the country is looking for balance again. Not perfect agreement, because Canada was never built on that in the first place. It was built through coexistence and compromise, through imperfect people finding ways to negotiate with each other anyway. And maybe that's the deeper challenge Canada is facing right now. Not whether one side defeats the other side politically, and not whether the country becomes less diverse. The real challenge is whether we can rebuild enough shared trust and shared identity for a country this complicated to continue functioning cohesively in the years ahead. Ultimately, countries don't survive on economics alone. They survive on whether people still believe they belong to the same story. If today's episode resonated with you, a lot of these ideas are explored more deeply in my books Canadianism, a calm alternative for a fractured country, and Democracy Renewed, the case for electoral reform in Canada. Both are available through The Canadianist at thecanadianist.news. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next episode. I'm Christopher M. Michaud. I'm a Canadianist. I invite you to continue the conversation at thecanadianist.news. And to find out more about the United Canadian Centrists and our vision for Canada's future, visit uccparty.ca. See you next time.
You've been listening to The Canadianist. New episodes daily. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Subscribe and stay connected. The Canadianist.